Good morning to our West Coast viewers, and good afternoon to those on the East Coast with me. I'm Laura Barone Lopez, a national political reporter for Politico. Today, we'll be discussing the future of Black and Brown social movements at a time when both populations across the country are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, racial and ethnic inequities are deepening, and thousands continue to protest police violence against Black people. I'm joined today by Julian Castro, former Democratic presidential candidate and former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Jenny Castillo, Regional Engagement Director for the Southern Economic Advancement Project, and Jonathan Jays Green, Vice President of Programs for the Marguerite Casey Foundation. We are also hoping to be joined by Representative Karen Bass later in the program, but there is the potential due to lots of work on the Hill that she may not be able to tune in. So with that, Jenny and Jonathan will be joining us later in the conversation. So right now, Secretary Castro and I are going to be taking it away with the discussion. Secretary Castro, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Laura.
Great, let's get started. So there is greater awareness around racial inequities due to COVID, due to the police brutality and protests spurred by the Black Lives Matter movement. But major institutions and others kind of want to move on sometimes in a very quick manner away from these very difficult conversations. And COVID is resurging. So how do you keep these issues of inequity at the center of the national conversation 3-4 months down the line?
Well, and thank y'all for putting this together. I think it's a very important conversation. As many people have pointed out, I mean, what this coronavirus experience has driven home is that the people who are most vulnerable, particularly in Black and Brown communities, have been the hardest hit in a public health sense and an economic sense as well, and in the continued fight for equality. You're right that we have a moment right now. Let's take changes to our law enforcement system as one example, or investments that we need to make in our public health infrastructure. This moment where people are focused on it, there's attention on it, attention on the inequities, that passes. I mean, not least of which because we live in a society, I think, where people have a very short attention span and a media-driven environment with constant news cycles. That have this tendency to move on to the next thing and then focus entirely on that instead of some of these issues. Your question is, how do we make sure that doesn't happen, and how do we take the steps that we need to take during this time? I would say, number one, we need to keep telling our stories. People out there who have been affected by COVID-19, who have been affected by police brutality, any number of other challenges, people need to keep telling their stories. We need to change institutions that tell those stories. Just yesterday, members of the Los Angeles Times, Latinos, raised an objection to the fact that LA County is 50% Latino, but only 13% of the reporters there at the LA Times are Latino. That's just one example in the media. But also when we think about policymakers who are sitting in positions where they could make changes on police violence or investments in healthcare, there needs to be pressure on them to make those changes now when we have that moment when public opinion is there. That's why I think that it's going to take everybody. It's going to take the people on the streets who are protesting. It's going to take the policymakers who have been elected by a lot of these Black and Brown communities with the hope that they're actually going to make a difference now, that them sitting in that seat is going to make a difference in the lives of their constituents. Those policymakers need to step up and do something now. And it's going to take changes in corporate America because, you can take symbolic but meaningful action like changing the name of your product or the logo or spokesperson for your product. But what are you going to do about hiring? What are you going to do about changing the internal culture of the organization? What are you going to do about the images that are cast about Black and brown communities that lead to the assumptions that we make that make it easier for a police officer to beat up somebody who is Black or brown. You know, what is corporate America going to do to actually change itself in this moment?
You ran a presidential campaign that was very intersectional, focused on intersectional politics. You also talked about police brutality at a time when a number of other candidates weren't talking about it. Where do you see that intersection and the coordination already occurring between Black and brown social movement leaders, and where else do you see room for improvement?
The good news is that there is a lot of a collaboration in the Latino community and the Black community. My mother was a Chicana activist, grew up with a mom that was a hellraiser when she was young, that was part of the Raza Unida party here in Texas, and then eventually became a Democrat. But one of the things that was very clear about the Mexican American civil rights movement is that it learned a lot from the larger civil rights movement that had preceded it, you know, by a few years. And I think that that's true now. You know, I think that communities are learning from each other. During the campaign, one of the things that we did was that we constantly reached out to the activist community.
One second, Secretary Castro.
Oh,
sorry,
course,
we
yeah,
have
yes,
Congresswoman. We have Congresswoman Karen
Bass
Bass joining us.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Congresswoman.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. To our audience, we have Congresswoman Karen Bass, who's joined us now. She is the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. Thank you. So, yeah, Secretary Castro. Secretary Castro, if you'd like to wrap up your.
Yeah, so Chairwoman, we're just addressing the, you know, the collaboration that exists
Yes.
between the Black and brown communities, and also the challenges. And let me get to just one challenge. You know, there's anti-blackness that exists in many communities, including in the Latino community. You know, to be Latino, you can have white complected skin, brown, Black, you know, everything in between. And I think in our own community, that's an issue that we need to address. I mean, you turn on Telemundo or Univision and see who's on TV, and you can see that there's a preference for light skin, right? There's still a colorism that exists and an anti-blackness. So there's a lot of work that we can do in our Latino community to change that.
On that note, Congresswoman Karen Bass, on the issue of anti-blackness that permeates so many institutions and structures and ways of life, what do you think people who are public figures like yourself and Secretary Castro can do to make sure that these difficult conversations continue, even if sometimes they aren't in the headlines?
Well, I think by raising them. I mean, I told Secretary Castro and your brother this, you know, I really appreciated during your campaign, you were always on the forefront of raising these issues. And I think that it's important because our people have far more in common than we do that is different. And in the Black community, I work on the whole issue of immigration and immigrants, and work with Black folks to understand, hey, there's Black immigrants too. And Black people come from many different countries. And so we have to never allow ourselves to be divided. I mean, one thing that I feel good about is that Trump has tried for 3.5 years, I mean, coming down the escalator, you know, attacking Mexicans, and what he has done on the border, the atrocities that I hope one day in the future, you know, he has to reckon with. And he tried to raise these issues in a way to divide our communities. And we never really divided. We never really went at each other. You know, you can always find an individual here and there, but the leadership and here in Congress, we work lockstep. CBC, CHC, CAPAC, which is the Asian Pacific Islanders, and now we have 2 Native American sisters who are part. So we call ourselves the Tri-Caucus Plus 2, and we do things in sync. And I think that it's really important to do that.
Congresswoman Bass, talking about what the House has done so far since we saw the mass unrest and protest across the country in response to the killings of Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. The House passed sweeping police reform legislation last month. And then a week later, the Movement for Black Lives, which, as you know, represents 150 organizations across the country, introduced their own federal legislation. They've gained allies in Representative Presley and Representative Tlaib. Do you support that bill, or do you see elements of it that could be incorporated into further reform bills?
Well, I work closely with them and have for years. Back to Black Lives Matter, I know Movement for Black Lives is a coalition exactly as you described it. And we're working together on the Breathe Act. I think that there are parts of it that absolutely, number one, there's parts of it that we actually already have legislation on, are working on, and then there's parts of it that I think are more challenging. But one of the main points of that bill is that it shows how you can cut federal spending and reinvest in communities. And that concept, that principle is something I feel very strongly about.
Which pieces of it, if I could just follow up, do you consider more challenging in the current environment? Is it that it calls for, the complete ending of certain big agencies and programs?
Right. Oh, that's an example. Absolutely. But as you know, because you've seen it, it's like 40 or 50 pages, and it's probably 200 programs or agencies. And so, yes, the wholesale elimination of programs, I think, would be challenging. So there's a lot of challenging pieces, but it's the principle of what the bill is trying to accomplish that I think is so important to talk about.
Secretary Castro, I wanted to move a bit to the pipeline of leadership that occurs, every election cycle. Candidates of color this cycle had recent wins and losses, whether it was in the presidential race or down ballot. So what systems are or aren't in place to help Black and brown candidates make it into higher office? And what do you see as Joe Biden's potential role, as he said, in bringing in the next generation?
Well, I think he has a fantastic role to play. I mean, he has played that role as well, right, throughout the years, helping to lift up and coming young policymakers, including people of color. And even more so now, I believe that he's going to become president and that he'll have just a tremendous opportunity to support people who are coming up, who are running for the first time across the country, or who are serving in office. I'm very encouraged by what we've seen recently, for instance, in the New York primaries. Fantastic folks like Mondaire Jones, Jamal Bowman that just got elected, and people that came very close, like Charles Booker in Kentucky, and people like Candace Valenzuela, who just won her primary in Texas. So across the board, you're starting to see more of a upswell of young Black and brown men and women who are stepping up to major positions. And I think that was always the hope of generations past, that it would help create opportunity for exactly those individuals who have the talent and the ability to step up. And so many people do. I mean, I just, the last thing I'll say on this is, I think about my mother's generation, and my mom, she ran for city council when she was 23 years old in San Antonio. And it was before they had single member districts. Very few minorities and very few women ever got elected, even to city council. But because of the hard work of her and her generation, I was able to get elected to city council when I was 26 years old, right? What we need to do is be intentional about passing that baton on and helping to lift up the next generation, because they have the talent. I don't buy it anymore that they're not out there, that they don't have the ability, that they do, and they are there. And, thankfully the CBC, the CHC, and a number of other organizations are supporting candidates in that pipeline.
On that note, a number of Democratic candidates who've won or are leading in their primaries in House races in Texas and New York, they identify as Afro-Latino. There are some current Afro-Latino members of Congress. But Congresswoman Bass, there's an informal policy of the Congressional Black Caucus that seems to prevent Afro-Latino members from joining the Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus at the same time. Do you plan to change that practice or call for a vote to address it in the bylaws as chair?
Well, first of all, it's not in our bylaws and it's not a policy. It has been a tradition mainly because it's something that we haven't faced before. And so, as I mentioned before, the diversity of the Black population, we have Black folks that are in the caucus who are of different backgrounds. We also have Bobby Scott, who is Afro-Asian, and he is a member of CAPAC. So it is absolutely something that we're going to need to take up and figure out how we deal with. It's something that's personal to me, considering my daughter called herself a Blaxican because she was half African American and half Mexican, and my stepkids are Mexican. And so it's an issue that is personal to me.
So you do think that members who identify as like your daughter, if
you're
a
Black
Mexican
Black.
is,
When the police pull you over, when the police pull
right.
over, which Richie, they don't say which one are you, and so
Right.
it's a discussion that.
Are you talking about Richie Torres, the New York member?
Yes,
sorry.
we spoke this morning. We're going to be meeting over the weekend.
Okay. Right, because for our audience, Richie Torres is a Congress member, or he's not a Congress member. He could potentially be one. Right, he's leading in the count for New York 15 congressional primary. He identifies as Afro-Latino and has been raising this issue the last few days.
Now, what was unfortunate, however, is that, when the new members come in, they're going to have to get adjusted to a legislative body. So a challenge that he's presented is, if you get out there publicly in the newspaper criticizing the body you want to join, needless to say, it doesn't leave that's not a very smart thing to do. So we're going to have to definitely address that. I called him this morning. I welcome him. I look forward to meeting him. And I know we will be discussing this over the weekend.
Yeah. And let me just say that,
yeah, go ahead,
Chairwoman Bass has pointed out, I think she's uniquely in a wonderful position to, to lead on these issues and understands these issues very, very well. Anybody who knows her history in the LA area, I had a chance to come to understand it during my presidential run.
Yeah.
For your leadership on this and other issues, Chairwoman.
Thank you.
And I know that we are pressed for time. We have about a few minutes left, but on this same topic, Congresswoman Bass, that you mentioned of, tension of when you're outside of the body versus when you come in. Congressman John Lewis, a founder of the civil rights movement, passed away a few days ago. Lewis often talked about making good trouble and protested aside younger generations, even recently. As has been the case in past racial justice movement, there is that tension in tactics between more established democratic figures and the new movement. This is a question for both of you. Congresswoman Bass, if you'd like to start, how do you reconcile that tension and work with this new movement?
Oh, first of all, I absolutely welcome the tension. And, part of the issue we were talking about too, the way it plays out is when you challenge incumbents. So for example, there was the other race in New York where Eliot Engel ran, and he incumbent for many, many years. Jamal Bowman, who's African American, ran against Eliot Engel. So I supported Eliot Engel. He's the chair of my committee, and it's not personal. And so what Jamal, and I've reached out to him as well, what he will grow to understand is that when you're in a legislative body and you work side by side with folks, and then you choose to support somebody against somebody you're sitting next to, doesn't bode well for you. But when you sit on the committee and he's your chair, it's nothing against Jamal Bowman. It's that I'm supporting the chair of my committee. I absolutely welcome the tension, the new folks that have come in, because my background is very similar to theirs. It's just that when I was their age, I didn't want anything to do with elected office. That's about the only difference. And so to me, I consider it my job and my honor and my responsibility to welcome them, to try to bring them in and to try to show them how they can be activists, agitating, and be productive within the body. we have a particular culture, and you have to be careful, otherwise you will marginalize yourself. And I don't want to see that happen to them.
Secretary Castro, same question for you. How do you reconcile, tension and work with the new movement as a leading figure yourself? Mm-hmm.
As they say, this is a tale as old as time, right? One generation to the next generation and so forth. It's natural. It's natural. And I think that, the best approach is one that combines the experience and the wisdom and the foresight and vision of folks who have seen a lot, and whose shoulders younger generation stands on, and then that energy and creativity and zeal of people that are just coming in to Congress, that are bringing new ideas. And there's nothing like just coming into a legislative body or any position, right? Because you're kind of half inside and half outside still in how you're thinking. And so there is a renewal that happens that is very valuable. And I have no doubt, though, that there's so much common ground there. And I mean, just look at AOC and Ilhan Omar and a number of other folks. They're doing both those very well. And Chairwoman Bass and others, I think have been great about integrating their voices. I expect that to continue, on the CBC side and the CHC side.
Okay. Secretary Castro, I appreciate your time with us. I know that you do have to leave. So we are going to transition to our next section. Congresswoman Karen Bass, if you're okay to stay with us for a few more minutes, we'd love to keep you on for the continuing section.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Great.
Castro.
Yeah.
Thank you, Secretary. And so now I'm going to be bringing in, as we said at the beginning, Jenny Castillo, as well as Jonathan Jays Green. Do we have? Hi, Jenny. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello.
Great, thank you. So, Congresswoman Bass, I'd like to continue with some of our discussion. What are ways that you think the two movements going forward, Black and brown social movements, at a time where we're seeing coronavirus disproportionately impact these populations, what can be done to encourage that they work in unison, and to dispel some misconceptions about the movements?
Well, I'm not sure what misconceptions you're talking about, but what I can tell you about is what we are very specifically doing. So the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, the CHC, the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, and the Native American women work together lockstep on coronavirus. And so specifically what we're doing is we have proposed funding that provides for aggressive interventions in each of our communities. So the Pacific Islander population, for example, in Northern California, has the highest disproportionate numbers. So we're calling for specific funding there. The other thing that we have done is that we went outside of Congress and we found researchers covering each of our groups, and we are collectively applying for money, actually not Congress, but the researchers that are Black, brown, Asian, and Native American. They are collectively applying for money from philanthropy, from major foundations, to do a national needs assessment looking at each of our populations, so that when we fight for resources or policy change on a federal level, we are doing it in complete solidarity, in complete unity, and we are backing each other up. One of the things that's happening right now is a real increase in anti-Asian violence because of what the president is doing around China. And so we hold press conferences and author, co-author, co-sponsor legislation. If one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked. If one of us has a disproportionate rate, all of us respond.
Congresswoman Bass, I believe that we have to let you go, but on a final quick note, could you clarify, are there specific pieces that you are hoping to get in this next coronavirus relief package that address the ongoing racial disparities?
There's specific pieces that's already in the bill that we put in the bill. So what I just described is already in the bill. We need
Okay.
the same act.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Thank you for joining us today. And so we will continue our conversation with Jenny Castillo, as I said at the top, who is the Regional Engagement Director for Southern Economic Advancement Project. Jenny works very closely in Georgia politics, and we also have Jonathan Jays Green, Vice President of Programs for Marguerite Casey Foundation. So thank you guys for joining us. I wanted to continue some of the conversation that I was having with Secretary Castro and Congresswoman Bass, specifically about new members coming into Congress who are pushing the norms in terms of their identities, whether they're Afro-Latino or, as Bass said, her daughter identifies as Blaxican. What do you see from the outside as things that can be done to improve the pipeline of Black and Brown candidates and the resources that they get or the endorsements that they get? Jenny, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. Hi, Jonathan. Glad to be here with you both. I think one of the major things is letting people believe that they can run. I think a lot of times we have it in our mind, especially people of color, that we're just not good enough. So we need to start dismantling that idea to make sure that people know that if you want to see change in your community, you can do that. That if you feel like there should be a stop sign in your street, you should be able to call your elected offices, officials, and let them know that you need to have a street sign there, right? And so we need to stop trying to think that it's us against them, this higher power that we're not a part of. Every elected position is filled by a person, not somebody who's had more training than you. They were just somebody who woke up one day and said, I wanted to see this change. So I think when we start thinking like that, we can help make sure that we're preparing our candidates to know how to speak about issues, to know what their issues are important to their communities, and to make sure that they're listening to the voter. Because ultimately what happens is a lot of times that people are running for office, they think about themselves and less about the people that they're running for. So I think that there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen, but a lot of education that is there that we can support folks of color who want to run for office.
And Jonathan, what do you consider things that could potentially change in terms of improving the pipeline or making it more encouraging, as Jenny said, for candidates of color to actually even take the step to run?
I mean, I think for me, it starts at the beginning, and the beginning is telling the truth about what is happening in our economy and our government. The fact is that our systems and our institutions are structured and were built in such a way to make sure that people like us were kept out of the process. They were built in such a way that our communities and our people are being exploited left and right. So I think for me, the animating force is not just to have more people of color in office, but it's really just to talk about people that are currently being exploited having an ability to make decisions about how our lives go on every day. So to me, that is both, yes, like the background, but it's also about ideology. And I think there are great examples across the country of people who are right at the intersection, thinking about Jabal Bowman, who was mentioned earlier on, you know, a middle school professor, African-American professor, who really deeply believes in, you know, restructuring our economy. Like that is like the kind of transformative change that I'm looking for. And I think for me, like we can't have this conversation without talking about how the system is not built for our people to run, how the system is not built for people from our communities to be able to have access to the money, to the power. But I think what this moment is giving freedom to do and really creating the political realities for is for change. I think the voters desperately are tired of business as usual, right? Whether that person looks like me or not. You know, I think it's really about what are the policies and what is like the world that they're pushing for. And I really believe that in this moment of transformation and possibility, that that is what the voters are looking for. So if there are people looking at this webinar who are thinking about it, I would definitely encourage them, because I think there is a hunger, right? So, and we have to be able to speak truth to power to like how these systems are built in such a way that are not welcoming for us. So in some ways, us being able to pull it off is a miracle. And I believe that miracles happen every day.
I wanted to, talk about the issues that are facing both the Latino and Black communities and the intersection of those issues. When you both talk to voters, what challenges overlap among the Latino and Black communities? I know Afro-Latinos are at the intersection of this, and what are also some distinct differences between in those issues that impact the communities? Jenny, do you want to talk about that first?
Yeah, I think one of the main things going across Georgia in the work that I've done, they all want the same things. They want equal access to great education. They want more opportunities to have housing that is safe and secure. I think most folks are looking for leaders that are going to help benefit and stimulate their personal economy, right? Like, how am I going to benefit from this person who's running? I've never heard of this person before. They've never been to my neighborhood. And why should I care? So I think there's a lot of intersectionality. I think there's also a lot of intersectionality with immigration, right? Immigration is not solely a Latinx issue. And that's been something that I think is super important for people to really understand, that there are immigrants coming from different countries. It is not solely a Latinx conversation. And I think a lot of folks have really changed that narrative when they're talking about DACA, and they're like, well, that's the only thing that the Latinx community cares about. And it's not true. It's one of the many issues that all Latinx communities are worried about, but also we are all trying to figure out how we can best our community, make our communities better, and make sure that we have access to all these opportunities. So we're not looking just to be put in a box. And then I think one of the harder parts of trying to be that echo for some people is that, well, you aren't, a person that went through the immigrant circles, right? I was born here. I was born in New York. I have parents who are citizens, and that's a different experience for me than the folks who do not have that pathway to citizenship like they thought that they would have. So I think it's super important to make sure that when we're talking about what are the differences, a lot of it is the same. It's just maybe in a different language, and we're trying to just make sure that we're all getting some resources out of the folks that are saying they want to represent us.
I think for me, just to piggyback on that answer, and so I am a part and the vice president of programs here at the Margaret Casey Foundation. We are one of the largest progressive funders in the country. We've been funding community organizing for the past 2 decades. So when we talk about the issues that our communities care about, we've been supporting organizations, primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations across this country that have been engaging our communities. And time again, what we hear from them is that people are really struggling right now. People are actually, and it's not just because of their fault, it's because, again, like our leaders have made choices that have left our communities out, that are being exploited, and in this moment to death, right? Really thinking about what's going on with the coronavirus. So as we're thinking about what worlds we're moving towards and where we want to go, we are really clear as a foundation, because of the work of leaders and organizers across the country, that what we're looking for is not just tinkering around the edges. What we're looking for is not just a slight tweak here and there. What we're looking for is not just more Black billionaires and people of color billionaires. What we're looking for is a radical reimagining of our country, of our economy, and of our government, so that it actually works for all of us, right? So when we're talking about the issues that our communities care about, people are struggling and they want solutions. Even thinking about the fact that as we're talking about the coronavirus, looking at what, if I can be blunt, crumbs like our elected leaders were able to deliver for working families and people while big corporations were bailed out. It's absolutely shameful, right? The fact that in this moment, Jeff Bezos is close to becoming a trillionaire, where there's over 40 million people who are unemployed, right? It's immoral. And I think where people are really looking for is people who are telling the truth about what is happening, and people that are proposing solutions that match the gravity of the problem that we're in.
Getting down to the policy, which both of you guys have started to touch on, we have a question from the audience, and I encourage people who are viewing to submit questions. We will be taking them. So this question is addressing anti-camping laws that are coming up in some cities across the U.S. So I think which we could also say are near anti-homelessness laws. And so they say that they've seen it lead to more police brutality towards Black and brown people. And this questioner asks, how do you ensure that there is a path to making housing a human right? Housing is also an issue, as we know, in the coronavirus crisis, crowded housing, and multi-generational housing, which again disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities. Jonathan, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, I think what I love about this moment and the work that the Movement for Black Lives and organizers across the country, abolitionist organizers across the country, have been leading us to is to ask fundamental questions about the purpose of policing in this country. Right now, we rely on police to answer and to solve problems that they're not equipped to solve. Whether it's mental health problems, whether it's houselessness problems, all these different things that we know that the more that police and law enforcement becomes in contact with our communities, that leads to abuse, that leads to excessive force, that oftentimes leads to death, as we're seeing across this country, as law enforcement agencies have been unleashing upon protesters across this country. So I think that for me, like, there is a fundamental question of what is the purpose of police and policing in this country that, again, the Movement for Black Lives has been leading us on in that demand of defunding the police. And what I love about that demand is that it also has the invest portion of that demand, and that it requires actually investing in community prevention, that actually requires investing in our schools, in our healthcare, and proper economic relief for people in this moment. If we actually address all of these things, then we will not have the issues that we have today. So what does it mean for us to stop thinking about or stop pushing for, the anti-camping laws that you push for, but actually push for our governments actually caring for our people in this moment of crisis? So I think that is where the focus ought to be.
Related, Jenny, we have another viewer who asks about the racial wealth gap and what is being done to address raising the minimum wage. Could you speak a bit, I guess, to the debates going on in Georgia, and or what you think also could be done writ large on those issues, especially as the racial wealth gap appears to be widening during this pandemic?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here too. Into the earlier question about anti-camping, and just also, can we just talk about how these different words and terms are just popping up every 5 seconds? But I think one of the biggest parts here is getting people involved in the process, right? Because a lot of times these processes and these policies are actually happening much closer than people think. They're happening on the city council level, they're happening on the county level. And I think it's super important to have people come and be a part of that, right? Because the scariest thing for any elected official is to see that the voter is paying attention and is going to run against them. So we need to make sure that our people are actually and actively being participants in this process. So if you haven't been to a city council meeting, you haven't been to your county, go show up, make sure that you're asking for these demands. And that goes to the racial pay gap as well. We're seeing it actively. In Georgia, it's been very clear that our organizations have been calling for a $15 minimum pay, but we're also seeing that that's still not enough. So we need to make sure that we're fighting and that we're working with organizations that are actually pushing this, because the more people that push it, the more organizations that say we need to pay our people living wages, then the more we'll actually see this change. I think ultimately people move to Georgia because just like my family did, it was cheaper to live in Georgia than live in New York. But we are seeing time and minute as it passes that Georgia is increasing with a lot of people, and Atlanta in itself is becoming like another small New York, right? It's very hard for folks to make rent. It's very hard for folks to find those jobs that will help pay them. I think there's a lot of programs that are happening on the city level that are trying to address that and trying to make sure that we are increasing the pay gap, but it's definitely something that we need all the folks that are listening right now to make sure that they are holding their elected officials accountable so that we can see these change actually happen.
And then, so Jonathan, I wanted to go back to the points that you were making about, it's not just about, you seem to be hitting on that it's not just about representation, it's also about ideology. This was an interesting dynamic that we saw play out throughout the Democratic primary. And voters ultimately went with a more established candidate. Black voters ultimately went with a more established candidate. So what do you see as the movement's ability to push a candidate like Biden, who appeared to be going against a number of progressive policies throughout the primary, but now has been shifting and appearing to adopt some of the movement's policies? What do you see as the future of the Black and Brown movement's ability to push a candidate like him?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Yes, about Biden, but really elected officials across the board. We at the Margaret King Foundation and community leaders across this country know that freedom and justice will not be delivered from an elected official. We know that liberation is not going to come from electing a president and electing a set of incredible members of Congress. Like, that is not the end all be all of this fight. For us as a foundation and for communities across the country, it is both about, yes, the election and what happens after. And what happens about how do we, for us, like, that means investing in community organizing with long-term support, which is what we do at the Margaret Casey Foundation. But for us, it's like, how do we help build infrastructure of community leaders across this country that can hold these leaders accountable, both at the ballot box, but also beyond when it comes to day one of governing, the 100-day agenda. How do we help build enough people power? How do we support leaders in their building of that people power so that we actually have an opportunity and an ability to shift the balance of power? That is what we're ultimately worried about and really working towards. And I think what we've seen in like the shifting of like policies recently, I think speak to how like community leaders across this country have been applying pressure. And I think that is going to continue. So we're really committed to investing in those leaders across this country so that after the November election, regardless of the result, that we can continue to hold whoever is in office accountable up and down the ballot.
And
Jenny, would you like to? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just want to add to that part too, that we also need to be investing in our staff structures of these campaigns. And it's so easy for organizations and campaigns to say, oh, we believe in diversity, we believe in it, and we believe that we're going to see the change, but then their leadership does not reflect that. Their leadership and decision makers need to be reflective of the community in which they're trying to get that vote. Because when they do not have that voice and they do not have folks that come with backgrounds that are different from the candidate, they're going to fail time and time again if they're not speaking to the community with a surrogate there to support them in speaking to them, and actually hold the power to make decisions for the campaign that's going to be beneficial to all the voters.
So speaking of voters, Latino voters are not a monolith. We all know that, the same way Black voters are not a monolith. Jonathan, I'm curious, when you're talking about progressive policies, which tend to be synonymous with liberal or quote the left, and if you're talking to people of Venezuelan descent, or Cuban descent. How do you address those conversations and talk to them about potentially more liberal policies?
That is a great question, and a question that I spent a lot of time thinking through the election cycle, the primary in particular. And I think this is why it's really important that we are investing in our communities and building our infrastructure, because we're able to then have better leaders who are prepared to have these conversations. And to me, it is both about really understanding like the politics and what is the history there, and really explaining in really easy to understand terms of what we're actually proposing. I think when we talk about issues like Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, the fundamental aspects of it are widely popular. And I think when we talk to our parts of our community, of our Latino community that tend to skew more conservative, I think we just have to do more work. We actually need to spend more time building relationships and having those difficult conversations about what it means and what is the world that we are working towards. I think oftentimes, even separate from this community, I think oftentimes when we talk about really progressive policies and there is like a backlash for it, I oftentimes think that it's because people don't fully understand, or we haven't done our job explaining what it exactly is that we're talking about and how we see it as possible. And I think there's a role for candidates to play to do a better job of really helping people taste, see, and feel this vision that we have for this country, about really wanting to honor human rights. It seems really basic to some of us, but people should be able to have enough food to eat. People should be able to have a roof over their head. People should be able to go to the doctor if they're sick, right? And I think really helping people visualize what that looks like, and then struggling through what are the ways to get there. It is not an easy process, but I think if we are invested in ushering in this new version of our world, then it is a work that is necessary to be done.
I want to talk about something that Castro brought up, and we've touched on a little bit, which is the anti-blackness that's within the Latino community. Jenny, how do Latinos target that and address it? And then also, what would you say to Latino advocates who, this is the other side of it, and we can dissect it, but what would you say to Latino advocates who are upset at the erasure of Latinos from the national conversation around police brutality? So we can divvy that up into parts.
Okay. So for the first part, I think calling everybody out at the same time that they say something, it's so real. They are anti-Black. My family's from the Dominican Republic. We have to have those conversations. We are Black, and that is what we are. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that our experience is different from the Black American experience. And we also can't just put identity on people, because there's some people that may not phenotypically look at what you believe is considered Afro-Latino, but they are. So we have to really be mindful of having honest conversations, of calling people out, but also accepting people for what their identity is. On the idea of this conversation with people thinking that there's an erasure of Latinidad within this movement, or speaking about that, I think it's really making sure that people understand that it's not an erasure. It's making sure that we're identifying what the actual problem is right now. We need to make sure that people are having the conversations that Black Lives Matter. And a reminder, because there is so much anti-Blackness in the Latino community, that they need to realize too that there's not a conversation when you get stopped in the middle of the night of, oh, are you Latino? My apologies. I'm not gonna have this discussion with you. They are arresting folks, and that conversation's not coming up. So I think we need to be very clear that it's not an us against them, right? We are one community. We are the Latino community, but we also have Blackness in our community, and that needs to be what's discussed. The erasure of this idea that we are not Black, that we do not fall in that same in that same vein about what's happening to the Black Americans in America. This is happening across our Latin American countries. This is happening across our generations. This is happening across every aspect, that we need to start making sure that we're having these real conversations, that when somebody says something out of pocket, that we're calling them out, whether we feel like, oh, I don't know if I can ever talk to my parents like that because they'll get mad at me. Okay, they'll get mad. And then they have now had a conversation about why you're upset about something. And we have to keep having those conversations and pushing it, because it's not just anti-blackness, right? It's anti so many things that people identify with. And we can't keep having the conversation of saying, well, it's okay because they're from another generation. Well, generations change, and we need to make sure that we're part of that generation change, so that when our children, our grandchildren are the leaders of this land, that they know that it's about the people first. And because of us, they were able to change that idea and not be so anti the people that they're trying to support.
Jonathan, do you have something to say on this topic, or I have another question for you?
Just really quickly, I think how I think about our work undoing systems of oppression in this world, it is that it is work that all of us have to do every single day. I believe that I, as a person, like, I'm working, and my work has been around racial justice, immigration, all these different things, and I have work to do. I have work to make sure that I have work to do to make sure that I'm not ableist. I don't have a disability, but that is something that I need to work on. I have work to do to make sure that I'm not erasing Native people and contributing to the historical oppression to Native people. So I think I generally like to start with that, just to make sure that people understand that all of us have work to do, and like, needing to do work doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means to do that. It just means that you're earlier on the timeline, and that is work that is required of all of us. And I think what Jenny said about having conversations with our family members, with people around us, is really important. Something that I would also add is really joining an organization, joining an organizing group that is doing really impactful work around these issues. I am a proud member of Mi Gente, and Mi Gente is a group of Latinx people who are explicitly pro-Black, pro-queer, pro-trans, pro-earth, all these different things, and that is like my political home. Find a political home across this country and find a group of people that you can sharpen your beliefs and your politics with. This is the moment to do it. So I wanted to just add that as well.
And so on the role of action, Jonathan, what do you consider the role of philanthropy in supporting Black and Brown collaboration and the movements?
Yeah, I feel really privileged that I came to the Marguerite Casey Foundation, because it is a foundation that has had a legacy of supporting Black, Indigenous, people of color leaders for around 20 years. When we actually tallied the numbers, it was like close to $450 million that had gone to like leaders across this country. So our commitment to our leaders is that we give general operating grants. So we give them money without telling them what to do with the money, and we give them money for multiple years, right? I really think the role of philanthropy in supporting the work that is happening on the ground is really write the checks and get out of the way, honestly. There's so much work that is happening every single day that our leaders are doing every single day, that I feel like the philanthropic sector has a tendency of asking things of grant recipients that we actually really don't need. Like when Carmen, Dr. Carmen Rojas joined as our CEO, and then I joined, and the rest of the leadership team with Rhonda as our Vice President of Culture. One of the very first things that we did is, one, we gave money on our first day. We committed $600,000 to local Black organizing groups in Minneapolis and Fort Lauderdale and in Louisville, because we said, if we talk about this moment being a moment of urgency, this is what urgency looks like for us. First day, let's give some money. And then the second thing is that we actually cut our applications by 50%. But actually, if people who are coming to ask for money, we actually don't need to be asking them to write these multi-page reports. If we actually trust their work, we don't need to be asking all of these procedural burdens. Because again, if we understand the crisis of the moment that we are in, and then that means that we are going to fund the work and get out of the way. So I really think that is like the spirit of urgency that I would love to see for the rest of philanthropy sort of move with. And, you know, really funding our community leaders, funding people who are organizing across this country. Organizing is one of the least invested in strategies when you look at philanthropic dollars. But in my view, it is the strategy that changes the world. So really focusing on funding organizing as well.
And to continue with questions from our viewers, from our audience, Jenny, this one is specifically for you. They ask, you know, identity can be complicated. So some Latinos see themselves as Afro-Latinos, others do not. How do we navigate that respectfully? And how, sorry, I'm trying to read this question. How do we accept others and what they connect to? They're asking.
Okay, this is like a super big question, has a super great answer. Accept everybody as they are, y'all. This is not a debate. You cannot debate who someone's identity is. If they come to you and they tell you that their name is Purple, call them Purple, y'all. If that is who they are, we need to accept people from where they're coming from, how they're coming as they are. I am somebody who has made sure that when I'm organizing, I'm going everywhere, every single place I can think of, even the bachata clubs that I love to go to back in the day. RIP 2019, because we can't do that anymore. But I would go and actually have my volunteer form so that people who wanted to ask me to dance, I said, yes, we can dance if you sign up for a volunteership. They accepted me for who I was, and then we danced and we got folks to know about the election. We got folks to really be a part of this because I did not want to change anybody. I wanted to be where the people were. So this idea of somebody saying they're Afro-Latino, accept it. If they say I'm Latina, accept it. If they say I'm Latinx, accept it. We are here to make sure that we are making people feel empowered by who they are, because who they are is the story that they're telling America. It's a story that they're telling the world. Who are we to put anybody on an identity? So if somebody comes up to me and they say, you know, I feel like you represent so much for me, I'm like, great. And if they ask me, like, what do I identify as? I will happily tell them I identify as Latina. I am proud to be Latina. I am so proud to be Dominican. I'm so proud to be American. But I am accepted because I'm authentically me. And that's what we need to do. If somebody is coming to you for help, support, guidance, all you have to do is to listen to them and provide them with support, because there's no other reason to not accept somebody, right? If that is who they are, we have to accept them.
Another questioner asks, Jonathan, how do you know, activists, organizers, lawmakers close the gap between the Latino and other immigrant communities? So how do they work together to ensure that all immigrant voices, Black and Latino alike, are heard?
So before this work, I co-founded an organization called the Untitled Black Network, organizing and building with Black immigrant communities across the diaspora, so African communities, Caribbean, Afro-Latinx people like myself, and really organizing around the principle of really understanding immigration to be a racial justice issue, a Black issue. And over those years doing that work, I really struggled. I really struggled with running up against all of the issues that exist within our Latino community, magnified and projected onto the immigrants' rights space. And I think what I found most helpful is both like, yes, like having those conversations with people about like what people's policy choices meant for my people, but also just like spending some time intentionally building solidarity with other people. Over 2 years, we did a series of convenings with NACASEC, who organizes Asian immigrants in particular, and Korean folks in particular. And we had political education conversations that at times were really tense. We had, you know, just really challenging conversations around like what it means to build like Black and Asian solidarity in this moment. And really even like confront it like to political action together. But I think it was that that model for me was really helpful because it was both about like the action that we took, the bills that we supported, whatever the external facing pieces, but it also was grounded in relationship building. I think oftentimes when we talk about solidarity and building like power across communities, what oftentimes gets left out is the pre-work. What oftentimes gets left out is the work intentionally in, in rooms and church basements, struggling through like readings and talking about the issues that exist in our community in a way that then makes our political action much more genuine. Like, I don't want to have a conversation with somebody who hasn't been struggling to like address the internal issues, especially around anti-blackness. I don't want to do the political work because I don't trust it, right? So I think when I'm thinking about the immigrant trade space, I think that is work that when we started Undocumented Black in 2015, there were some pockets where it was happening, but not enough. I like to believe that with our work with Undocumented Black, we really contributed to opening that door really wide. And as I think about and I look at this moment, this political moment, racial reckoning in this country, I've seen it deepened in a really organic and really beautiful way. Both people in the streets showing up, but also people doing intentional work behind the scenes as well. So I think it is happening. It just needs to be a lot more, and it needs to be a daily commitment.
Jenny, did you want to add anything on that before I move on to the next question?
No, he said it.
Okay. So Jenny, this is an Atlanta-specific question. One of the viewers asks, Atlanta's population is actually growing amongst the Black and Brown communities. So what opportunities do you see in your line of work to coalition build with that changing population?
Yeah, I mean, Atlanta is growing. I'm telling you, it used to be very small. Now we got people just everywhere. So we have a joke, Atlanta's full, go home. But we are super happy to see people trying to come in, trying to do stuff. And I think there's so many opportunities. I think just the recent protests saw how folks can coalesce and organize together. But I think one of the main things and what I always tell when I'm doing organizing and working with different groups is that the biggest thing, the biggest secret to a great organizer is to be organized, right? Because people have these grand ideas. We can do all this coalition, we can do all these events, we can make it happen, but they never write anything down. They never get a date. They never check out a venue. They don't actually put in the work to make it happen. And then they're surprised, oh, why didn't anybody show up? Well, you didn't advertise it. Or you told the 5 people about it, and the 5 people had 17 other things that they were doing, and they weren't able to make this work. So making sure that you're dedicated and organized to the cause, we can make so much happen, whether that is through the arts or through social movement or really just getting folks together on educating them on the process. There are tons of different groups, including the Blue Institute that focuses on training young people of color who want to work in these spaces. So look us up on Instagram. And also making sure that we are actively talking and having conversations with people about what it is that we need, right? Because a lot of times organizers are like, well, this is what's important to me. Well, is that what's important to the organization that you're trying to build? Is that what's important to the folks that you're trying to collaborate with? So really, there's a lot of great space for that. There's a lot of great professional spaces that we can build that. I'm also a member of the Hispanic Young Professional Entrepreneurs that's really focusing on building those coalitions, right? For folks who are trying to build their businesses. And a social entrepreneur is so important to the change that we're trying to see. So really trying to make sure that we are uplifting that. Atlanta is also a very small city. Let me tell you, you go to the mall, everybody's going to see you. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. It's very different than any other city. So I think we have a really good future ahead of us to really make some coalitions happen. But again, making sure that folks who want to do this work are organized and focused to make sure that we can make the biggest splash that we can in Atlanta and Georgia in general.
So I asked this question of Secretary Castro as well as Congresswoman Bass, but this is also from a viewer to the two of you. So we all know that this is a transformational moment in America. whether it's the unrest happening across the country in response to police brutality or the coronavirus pandemic, and the potential economic recession. So the viewer is asking, a questioner is asking, what can be done to promote and ensure multiracial solidarity, and how do you, in the roles that both of you have, try to keep the conversation going so it isn't a brief moment and keep it going months, years down the line?
I could take it, Jonathan, first. I think it's exactly that. It's not just been the one conversation. Since I started getting involved in politics, I literally was just looking for work. I was like, I don't know what else to do. So I started volunteering. And then from there, I was asked to apply to work for Stacey Abrams as a legislative aide. And I was like, well, I'm super educated, but I have no idea what any of those words meant. So I had to look it up. I had to go to myself and say, how do I get involved in this? And since being involved, I have had so much more knowledge given to me and so much more opportunity. So I think it really is that if you don't know how to get involved, find us, right? Get us to answer these questions and answer our calls too. I think a lot of times I try to host a lot of events, whether it's through my professional work or through my volunteer work, of really letting people know what the process looks like, of educating them on civic engagement and really trying to get folks to understand the process. And I just want people to say yes more, right? Say yes to this, but also trying to hold our elected officials accountable and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't just have meetings at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. People are working. Maybe we should be having weekend meetings or having evening meetings so that we can get more people invested in this. I think that there's a really great space for people to learn and grow, but we also have to make it accessible to folks. We can't just keep putting the onus on them that you should learn about this, you should figure it out, you should come to it. No, we as organizations, we as educators should be educating people where they are. So to the folks that are listening, if you are an elected official or if you are working in the space, encourage your staff to plan events that will allow folks to go out and speak to the voters, go out to speak to the community. Stacey Abrams always did that when she was in office. We had events that were accessible to the people because she wanted to make sure she was hearing people. And so that's what we have to continue to do.
Jonathan, same question to you before we go.
Yeah, I think I'm really taken by the question for a variety of reasons. One, the protests haven't stopped, right? So there are active opportunities for people to engage. And I don't think they'll stop for anytime soon, right? Like, I think this is different than previous moments we've experienced, and I really want to make sure that people are able to really take that in, like what that looks like with people taking action, that actual initial moment of action leading to codified results. So we're seeing action at the legislative level, we're seeing action at the departmental levels across this country, and I think everywhere people are, there are opportunities to engage locally, nationally. I definitely look to the Movement for Black Lives as a source of guidance of what is happening. I know they introduced the Brief Act in Congress, and you talked a little bit about it in the beginning of the panel, but pushing the local members of Congress to sign on to actually put their money where their mouth is, and if they're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, actually match it with actions that demonstrate that Black lives do matter, not just in slogan, but in actual policy and actual budgets across this country. I also do think that this is an opening for people to just really deepen relationships. I know that might not feel like the most urgent things at the moment, but I think it's important to do that as well, because that ensures that the work that we do together lasts and that it actually has the opportunity to transform us all in the process. So I really want to make sure people really think about it in that way. I also want to, talk a little bit about what's happening recently in Portland and other cities across this country, where I believe that we as a country are gradually but decisively, tearing into authoritarianism, where like police forces are kidnapping people without identifying themselves and, abusing people across this country. So I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. And what that requires is for people to really be thoughtful about what their role is. It's not everyone's role to be at the protest, but if that's you, you should do that. If it's your role to like host the community conversations, if it's your role to like support the local organizations, if it's your role to donate, do that. Like everyone has a lane to play and a role to play in our broader fight for freedom and justice. And this is the time to join. Like there's never been a more appropriate time to join our fight. And if you've already joined our fight, there's never been a more appropriate time to recommit to the fight. And if you already recommitted to the fight, there's never been a more appropriate time to double down on your investments in the fight. So I think this moment, to folks who are watching, this is your moment to act, to join us, to do more, because that is the only way we'll get to actual freedom and justice.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Jenny, for joining us for this illuminating and insightful conversation about Black and Brown social movements, political movements, and the future of them. We are going to welcome Sonia Diaz for closing remarks. She is the founding director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. Hi, Sonia, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lada. I just want to say on behalf of the organization, thanks to all the panelists who joined us for a very robust and vibrant conversation about coalition building. In fact, Jonathan defined it as the pre-work, which I think is often not seen when we just see everything on the streets. And Jenny talked about the timing, the messaging, the advertising, all of the work that goes into really building sustainable transformations in this country, even in the face of authoritarianism. I really want to thank you, Lada, for moderating such a poignant conversation and really bringing in all of the stuff that you observed directly in covering the Hill. I think that this is huge. Leaders like Representative Bass and Secretary Castro have been doing the work, and they've been doing the work oftentimes because they believe in it, because of their own histories as they both shared, but because it matters. And I'm really thankful for folks like Jenny and Jonathan who are driving this on the front lines every day so that we actually have leaders not just for today, but really for tomorrow. What we learned today is that Latinos have an important role to play in the movement for Black lives and really in protecting Black life. And despite the nuances and the intersections and the erasure and the frustrations, there is a need to think through a new reality that simply cannot be done without coalitions, and those take work. And as we think about so many things that these communities have in common, in addition to the diaspora, but police brutality, the higher rates of infection and mortality with COVID-19, joblessness, the looming and continuing eviction crises, and voter disenfranchisement, there's so much on the line. And so we've seen this, and we've seen a lot of action. But part of what we want to do is ensure that the actions are actually mandates for change. Yesterday, I was on a call with a lot of Latino leaders. We had a convening in California to get intergenerational voices to identify for housing, for climate change, for voting, for political representation. What's the policy platform? We're going to announce this tomorrow. But what's clear is that this is not in a silo. This was made possible because of the movement for Black lives, which really have opened the window for reallocation, reinvestment, and in fact, a change in the way in which we have a society and healthy communities. So I really, want to continue to work with you all for thinking about an inclusive future, right? That make sure that data and facts are included, but also that those data and facts include demographics and geography. And so as 2020 has been a science fiction roller coaster for all of us that I think only Octavia Butler could have imagined and dreamed up, one thing's clear to me from this conversation. We can't return to the old normal. And when we chart a path forward, especially in the streets and in chambers of power, we'll only get stronger if we work together. And I'm really excited for continuing this dialogue because I think it's really necessary. Big shout out to Jonathan and Jenny. You all had me cracking up. I loved it. Yes, Jonathan, please give us all the money. And Jenny, yes, however you identify, just if your name's Purple, call me Purple. And you know, that's the attitude. So for everybody watching, thanks for engaging with us. You can follow us at UCLA Latino. Thank you, Lara. And everybody out there, please be safe. Take good care.
Thank you.